Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Natalie Bernasconi, and I'm the Executive Director of IISD Europe and lead IISD Economic Law and Policy Program. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on greening aid for trade and the SDGs. We are co-hosting this by the International Institute for Sustainable Development and the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs. We thank the government of the United Kingdom for supporting this event and related research. Today, we will have an opportunity to take stock of the main policy issues around the aid for trade discussions, in particular, the linkages to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Aid for trade is an integral part of SDG number 8, which is aimed at promoting sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Target 8A calls on the international community to increase aid for trade support for developing countries, in particular, least developed countries. Aid for trade programs are fundamental for increasing trade flows and diversifying export markets, but more is needed to make trade an engine for green growth and poverty reduction. Achieving the SDGs requires integrated policy approaches and trade-offs as well. In this regard, aid for trade should continue to contribute to the economic objectives of developing countries by expanding trade. But they should also pay particular attention to achieving social objectives by reducing poverty and inequalities and meeting environmental objectives. There are many opportunities for greening aid for trade by integrating mitigation and adaptation into aid for trade initiatives and programs. For example, sustainable and green infrastructure will not only facilitate trade and enhance economic opportunities, but can simultaneously have environmental benefits, build resilience, and help adjust to shocks. The World Trade Organization's Aid for Trade initiative is one area where this discussion is developing quickly. As WTO members review progress to date and prepare the Aid for Trade program of work from 2022 onward, ensuring that these efforts incorporate sustainability considerations will be critical to ensuring a robust, green, and inclusive recovery. Today, we have a really fantastic panel. Our panelists will address some of the main policy questions relating to aid for trade, and in particular, to greening aid for trade. First, Dr. Carolyn Deer-Burbeck, who is the director of the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs. She will share the main findings of a research paper that will be released later this summer. Her presentation will be followed by interventions from two experts. First, Mr. Michael Roberts, who is Aid for Trade Coordinator at the WTO Development Division, and Mr. Olivier Cataneo, who is the head of the Policy Analysis and Strategy Unit at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate. After these presentations, we will have 5 discussants. First, the Honorable Dr. Mohammed Muchaba Piracha, who is Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Pakistan to the World Trade Organization. Then, Ms. Annegret Brous, who is Coordinator of the Green to Compete initiative at the International Trade Center. Then my colleague, Ms. Lisbeth Kazier, who is Senior Policy Advisor at IISD. Our friend Rashid Kaukab, who is the Executive Director of CUTS International in Geneva. And last but not least, Ms. Stacy Mills, who is a consultant at the Environment and Trade Hub at the UN Environment Program. So this is a great panel we have. And I would now like to turn over to Soledad Leal Campos, my colleague who co-leads IISD's work on sustainable trade and who will be moderating today's panel discussion. Have fun. I look forward to the next hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie, for your introductory remarks. I'm very pleased to moderate this webinar on greening aid for trade. But before introducing our first speaker, we thought it would be a good idea to launch a poll, a short one. As some of you have seen before at IISD, when we conduct events which bring together different practitioner communities, we like to start by launching an anonymous poll to have a sense of our audience's level of familiarity with the issues under discussion. This has proven to be useful for speakers and discussants since the results give an indication of the areas where further explanations or details may be needed. Today, we would like to ask 3 questions regarding the level of familiarity of our audience with the Aid for Trade initiative, the Agenda 2030, and the trade and environment policy linkages and how these connect to the Aid for Trade programs. I would like to ask my dear colleague, Sofia Alicia Baliño, who is ELP's Editorial and Communications Manager, to please help us launch the poll. So here are the questions. As you can see, we have 3 questions. How familiar are you with the Aid for Trade initiative? Then with the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, and with the linkages between trade and environmental policy. I think we can close it now, Sofia.
Great, I'll close it and I'll put the results up on the screen.
Yes, could you please read the results, share them with us, please?
Great, thanks, Sol, and thank you everybody for participating. It's great to see the range of experiences here. So we'll see that nearly a quarter of our audience is very familiar with Aid for Trade, and a larger share is somewhat familiar, and many are relatively new to it, about 40%. So it means we have an exciting conversation ahead. We see that most of our audience, I'd say around 97%, is somewhat or very familiar with Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. And we've got a good level of familiarity with the trade and environment nexus, about half somewhat familiar, and nearly half are very closely involved in this field. So I think it'll prove a very rich discussion.
Thanks very much, Sofia. So now, having launched and concluded the poll, we can turn to the great panel that we have today. As Natalie has indicated, we will have 3 speakers and 5 discussants who will share their perspective on some of the main policy issues at stake relating to Aid for Trade. We are very honored to have an outstanding panel that includes representatives from government, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and academia. After the respective interventions, we will open a segment of questions and answers. Please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A or chat boxes at any time during the discussions, and we will aim to address as many of them as we can. So let me explain the purpose of this webinar. The purpose is threefold. First, we will revisit the origins and evolution of the Aid for Trade initiative, see how this connects to the broader Sustainable Development Agenda and the SDGs. Second, we will see how environmental considerations have been included in the discussions on Aid for Trade and how these considerations are taken forward by different actors, including by WTO members on the road to the WTO 12th Ministerial Conference known as MC12 and the 2022 Aid for Trade Global Review. Third, we will have an exchange of views on some of the main policy issues at stake and on what is needed for this initiative to support developing countries in the fulfillment of their broader sustainable development objectives. Having said that, I would like to turn to our first speaker, Dr. Caroline Birkbeck, who is the director of the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs. She will share the main findings of the scoping paper she authored. This paper maps the Aid for Trade landscape and related initiatives and addresses some of the main policy issues which need to be considered to align Aid for Trade initiatives with sustainable development objectives. Caroline, welcome. You have the floor.
Great. Thank you so much, Soledad and Natalie, for the introduction and for setting the context so well. It's really a pleasure to co-host this event with IISD today. So I'm going to share briefly some of the key findings and messages from our forthcoming paper. So to begin, greening international trade will require a systematic approach to the challenges and opportunities facing developing countries in light of their wider sustainable development priorities and the SDGs. Developing countries will require support so they're not unfairly disadvantaged in this push for greener trade, and so that they're not marginalized as we move towards a greener global economy. Many developing countries recognize that environmental degradation is a central economic challenge for them domestically and is damaging their trade prospects. But the triple challenge of advancing COVID-19 recovery, adapting to environmental risks, and shifting to more environmentally sustainable production are hugely expensive undertakings that involve significant political trade-offs. The financial bill for all of this is well beyond what most developing countries can afford. Now, as Natalie and Soledad mentioned, aid for trade is a vital part of the policy framework for increasing the participation of developing countries in trade and ensuring this supports sustainable development. And as Natalie has noticed, the discussion of environmental issues is increasingly prominent at the WTO, as is the greening aid for trade agenda. It's emerged as a topic in the context of discussions at the Committee on Trade and Development, in the recent Aid for Trade Stock-Taking Conference, and as a theme for the 2022 Global Aid for Trade Review. It's also emerged in the WTO structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability. So just quickly, some facts on aid for trade. So aid for trade represents a significant portion, as much as 25%, of official development assistance. Since 2006, over $409 billion have been dispersed and over $350 billion in concessional loans. Importantly, more than 3/4 of those disbursements have gone to 4 sectors, 3 of which, transport, energy, and agriculture, have clear environmental implications. So some of the findings that I note in the paper are firstly that there's been limited focus on environmental aspects in green aid for trade to date. At present, the Aid for Trade initiative does not have an overarching set of environmental goals, priorities, or indicators to set the framework for donor support. There's limited monitoring of environmental aspects of aid for trade, and there has not yet been any overarching environmental assessment of aid for trade or recommendations for improvements in environmental impact. There are donors that incorporate some environmental impact assessment or apply environmental criteria, but these are at the discretion of the individual donors involved, and approaches vary widely. The second key finding is that green aid for trade financing falls far short of needs. The resource gap facing developing countries in their efforts to transition to a green economy and reap more value from green supply chains is huge. And meanwhile, developing countries bear the greatest burden of the economic cost of environmental degradation and have the fewest resources available for supporting transition. Some of the countries that are most vulnerable to environmental shocks, such as small island developing states, face significant hurdles in accessing external support as well because of their relatively high GDP per capita. Now, shortfall in financing, green financing for aid for trade is not unique. It reflects shortfalls in environmental financing in general. At the recent G7 meetings, countries failed to present a concrete plan for how they plan to meet their Paris commitments, for instance, to provide $100 billion in financing for developing countries. A third finding is that there's poor integration of the relevant sources of finance for developing countries that countries face a trade finance gap, a technology gap, a climate finance gap, and a gap of private sector investment in green sectors and exports, especially for MSMEs. And at present, there's no way of linking these various sorts of finance together, even though all of those are aiming to support the same kind of green economic transformation, in a principle in line with wider sustainable development goals. So looking forward, our approach to greening aid for trade needs to be underpinned by 3 understandings. First is the principle of common and differentiated responsibilities in international environmental law, and that is that developing countries should not pay an unfair share of the burden for environmental action. The second is that we need to remain aware of competitiveness concerns. Few developing countries can come close to matching the scale of resources that developed countries devote to subsidies, R&D, innovation, and government procurement to green their economies, decarbonize, and build their competitiveness in a green global economy. And the third is that green aid for trade needs to be coupled with a wider enabling policy environment that supports not only the shift toward greener economies, but helps countries leapfrog carbon-intensive development paths and is aligned with their wider sustainable development goals. So this means ensuring that trade rules and policies address the needs of developing countries As time is short, I will come back to those later. But it also means removing financial hurdles. And this can include debt relief that would liberate fiscal resources and put them at the service of the environment, and phasing out trade finance that exacerbates environmental challenges. So we're both looking for the good side of finance, and also reducing the bad side of finance that makes problems worse. Now, the paper notes a number of specific priorities for greening aid for trade, such as those related to supporting sustainable, climate resilient infrastructure, building supply side capacity for green economic diversification and exports, addressing trade-related challenges arising from environmental degradation and climate shocks, such as natural disasters and climate adaptation, and also building the regulatory and policy frameworks that would help developing countries reap greater returns from their participation in a green global economy. So looking ahead, greening aid for trade in ways that advance sustainable development would call for a four-pronged approach. The first is putting beneficiary countries firmly in the driver's seat in terms of prioritization and coordination of assistance, grounded in country-led needs assessment. The second is mainstreaming environmental considerations in aid for trade. And the third is adding more financing for environment-related activities and a greater number of genuinely environmental projects in line with the express priorities of developing countries. And the fourth is to link green aid for trade activities to wider efforts to green the global economy. And here I mean in the areas of climate, trade finance, and also debt relief. So what could be done in 2021? At the WTO Ministerial, ministers could agree to advance a green aid for trade agenda in a ministerial declaration on trade and environmental sustainability. They could call upon the OECD and the WTO Secretariat to support governments to undertake an environmental review of aid for trade with an eye to identifying goals and priorities, best practices, and to improve monitoring, all with this wider sustainable development frame in mind. Third, they could call for a summit, an aid and finance for green trade summit that would bring together all of the relevant actors, not just in aid for trade, but in environmental finance, trade finance, and debt relief to boost coherence among these areas. And finally, in the lead up to the Aid for Trade Global Review, governments could work to develop a clear set of environmental goals and priorities and targets for the Aid for Trade initiative going forward that supports and advances sustainable development priorities of beneficiary countries. So that's all from me. That's a quick snapshot of the report. Thank you.
Many thanks to you, Caroline, for this presentation, which highlights some of the main research findings contained in the scoping paper, which raises fundamental policy questions and points to the gaps existing in a broad range of areas. You have also identified, among others, 4 pathways towards a greener aid for trade agenda, which will be discussed in the next segment. Thanks very much again. I would like to turn to our next speaker, Mr. Olivier Cataneo, who is the head of the Policy Analysis and Strategy Unit in the Development Cooperation Directorate at the OECD. Olivier, could you please explain in a nutshell what is Aid for Trade and how the initiative has evolved since it was launched at the WTO Hong Kong Ministerial Conference back in 2005? And also what data is available on the environmental dimension of Aid for Trade and what are some of the key trends? Also areas where more information may be needed. Many thanks, Olivier. You have the floor.
Thanks, Soledad. And I think I saw that 40% of the participants were not familiar with the Aid for Trade initiative. So just to give a bit of background, I mean, Aid for Trade, I mean, is aid that is aimed to ensure that developing countries that are lacking, I mean, the basic infrastructure or trade capacities can still benefit, I mean, from the results of further trade negotiations and opening. So that was the idea of the beginning of the project. So statistically, and the OECD is maintaining, I mean, the database on aid and including Aid for Trade. It includes a number of what we call purpose codes, descriptions of the projects by donors that include the technical assistance for trade policy and regulation, trade-related infrastructure, productive capacity building, trade-related adjustment, and other trade needs. And this all represents, as Caroline mentioned, roughly 1/4 of all official development assistance, i.e., 46.6 billion of disbursement in 2019. So, but we think that, and that's a good example with the greening aid for trade, that as you mentioned, it was linked, to the negotiations in the WTO and very much to market opening. We think that today, there is a need also to evolve with the definition of aid for trade, and the green recovery or the build back better, whatever you call it, after the crisis is a good illustration, because we know we will need more transfer of clean technologies, we'll need more skills to be developed, in developing countries. We'll need to build a pipeline of sustainable projects in developing countries, and we'll also need to deploy, new tools, new forms of financing, like the blended finance, that brings together the public and the private. So now turning to your second question about the data available on environment dimensions of aid for trade, we use in our database, what we call markers. So basically the project managers, tick a box if they think it's related to environment. And we have no less than 5 markers on environment. The first one is a broad one on environment, whether the project contributes to improving environment or integrating environment concerns into policies. So that's the broadest one. Then we have more specific markers, one on climate change mitigation, one on climate change adaptation, and 2 markers on desertification, and on biodiversity. And within each marker, the project manager can say whether, it's the main purpose of the project, or if it's just simply, significantly important in the project. And if we look at those environment markers, the good news is that over the past decade, the number of projects that had a green marker went from 45%, 10 years ago, to 60% today for the Aid for Trade portfolio. So this represents roughly 20 billion of aid where there is a green marker. Then if you look at climate change, specifically, you see that it's mainly about mitigation, around 16 billion, and much less on adaptation, only 6 billion. But we see that this use of the markers, is not fully satisfactory because it's complex. There are many markers, they overlap. And also there is a huge risk of washing. People ticking the box without having a real green purpose to the project. And for instance, last week we suppressed the trade marker because we thought it was not reflecting the importance of aid for trade. So we are working towards modernizing our statistical tool to use machine learning, artificial intelligence. And we have developed an algorithm that reads through the aid projects and tells us whether the computer finds it's green or not. And actually, it's very interesting to see the contrast with the marker because the computer finds for SDG 13 only 3% of the project this SDG. For SDG 14, only 1%, and for SDG 15, only 3%. So all the bulk of the Aid for Trade contribution are more for SDG 2 in agri-food, or in SDG 7, 8, and 9 on infrastructure and productive capacity. So this raises the question again of the greenwashing. And as we have done, for instance, for gender, we compared, the marker with the computer results and then manually double-checked everything to make sure the computer was right. And we found 70% of gender washing. So the question again for the green is whether this is mainly gender greenwashing or something else. So I will leave it here and come back for the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks to you, Olivier, for this presentation on the origins and evolution of the Aid for Trade initiative, the inclusion of environmental considerations, and more important, the data collection. Thanks for explaining to us what the OECD is doing, and in particular, how they are modernizing the statistical tool. As you said, hopefully we'll come back to that in the next round. Thanks very much. I would like to turn to our next speaker, Mr. Michael Roberts, who is the Aid for Trade coordinator at the WTO Development Division. Michael, we have questions to you. We have seen an increased interest among groups of WTO members in the linkages between trade and environment policies. In the WTO context, we would like to ask how the environmental considerations emerged in the Aid for Trade discussions, how they are addressed in the lead up to the 2020 Global Review, and whether you could share some of the priorities outlined by both donors and beneficiaries. The floor is yours, Michael.
Thank you very much, Soledad, and thank you to Carolyn and Natalie for setting, and Olivier for setting out the setting the scene so well. So let me answer very briefly your questions. So have environmental considerations arisen in Aid for Trade today? The answer is yes, but periodically. Then looking ahead to 2022, what can we expect? Really quite a lot, I think, is the simple answer to that. So let me try and expand that theme, and maybe also try and give some very initial reactions to the points that Carolyn raised as well. So periodically, what do I mean by that? Well, Olivier's already outlined how the use of the green marker has grown over time, where you can see, if you go back to the 2006 Aid for Trade Task Force recommendations, there is a reference to sustainable development, but it took us until 2012 to have some kind of activity within the Aid for Trade work programs that really kind of addressed green development, sustainable development, and the green economy. Then if you fast forward to 2019, the global review there, you can see that it was starting to grow amongst the sessions that were organized at the global review that year, and also in the preparatory work for it. You can also see that in the at a glance report itself. So if you look at go back to 2011, you'll just find 2 mentions of circularity, and 35 mentions of sustainability. Fast forward that to 2019, and those numbers go up, and you see 130 references to sustainability in the 2019 report. I think it's fair to say that sustainability has very much been framed within the context of the 2030 agenda. And so there, the Sustainable Development Goals. And here, I think it's maybe worth just picking up on the point that Carolyn was making in relation to alignment with priorities. There are obviously two sets of priorities there. One is the priorities of the receiving countries and the priorities of the donor countries. And there you can see that there is that over time, the sort of the role that sustainability is playing, is being picked up in those priorities has grown. So if you look at affordable clean energy, you can see that in 2019 it was picked up as 44% of respondents picked that up, and it was actually a higher rate of prioritization amongst the partner countries than amongst the donors. So there, it's not an either or in terms of saying, is it a prioritization amongst developing countries that's missing, or is it a prioritization amongst donors that's missing? It's really much, I think there's work to be done on both sides as far as that's concerned. And that's where I think it's important to bring in the global review and the preparations for next year fundamentally, the initiative that is run at WTO is a monitoring initiative. So what we're trying to do is really track that prioritization, those flows, obviously in partnership with the OECD. And for that, and then really sort of, to make the case for the prioritization for the resources that Carolyn was talking about. But that prioritization needs to be aligned with national priorities. So that's one of the things that we're looking to do in the context of the next year's global review, is to find out how much, to what extent are developing countries and their development partners prioritizing greening. They're prioritizing actions on mitigation, adaptation, sustainable development, green trade, all of these different concepts that are out there. So on the basis of that information, that will give us a very good baseline moving ahead as we move ahead to the global review, and then obviously the work that follows on from that. So a lot of work there to do, which Ambassador Piracha of Pakistan, who is the chair of the CTD, the Committee on Trade and Development at WTO, will be leading. And we will be working very closely with him in terms of framing and conceptualizing that agenda with the input, of course, of WTO members. So with that, my thanks again to you, and my congratulations to Carolyn for that that excellent overview and paper, which I look forward to reading in due course. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Many thanks, Michael, for your intervention, in which you share some of the recent developments in the aid for trade discussion in the WTO context. You highlighted the need to further identify priorities and to align with the priorities of developing countries. And thanks also for sharing their insight into the preparatory process for the 2022 global review. So we'll come back to that later on. Many thanks again. After these three very insightful presentations, we will have the pleasure to listen to our 5 outstanding discussants who will make interventions for a maximum of 5 minutes each. Before introducing our first discussant, I would like to invite participants to start sending questions through the Q&A chat function. We will address those questions after the interventions from our discussants. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our dear colleague, Mr. Rashid S. Kaukab, who is the Executive Director of CEST International Geneva. Rashid, thanks very much for joining. We would be very interested in your views on the relevance of the Green Aid for Trade agenda for developing countries and their civil societies, and on what would be required for this initiative to advance their trade and sustainable development priorities. For instance, if you could share some thoughts on what are the opportunities, risks, and challenges that those discussions on Green Aid for Trade should address, and how do you see this agenda be taken forward at the MC12? Thanks, Rashid.
Thank you very much, Soledad. My very sincere thanks to you, Natalie and Caroline. A pleasure to be here. And as always, it was very informative to hear Caroline, and I'm looking forward to reading that paper. And also Olivier and Michael, as always, great job. I wanted to briefly mention the opportunities, risks, and challenges. But before that, I think it will be really important that I can say a few points which sets the context, which in my opinion is extremely important. If you look at the aid for trade, I would say some broad trends, and I would identify 3, let's say in the last decade or so, in very broad terms, which are overall, what I would say are quite positive. There was a move towards more diversification and structural transformation, more longer term impact, which was of course at the request and in terms of the needs of developing countries and LDCs. Also a very significant move towards away from a silo mentality of trade only, but also trying to look at issue linkages like gender, micro, small and medium enterprises, environment, digitalization, climate change, etc., as we heard. And also an effort to align aid for trade with the relevant SDGs. So these I would call overall broad trends emerging, which were quite positive. Now in that setting, COVID hit us, and one can see immediately two things happening. One is the aid for trade amounts, in some cases by some donors, have already been reduced, and others may also follow given the hard economic times. And then also, of course, very understandably, the emphasis of using whatever ODA is available towards more urgent needs, like in the area of health, of course, are taking precedence. So in that kind of situation, what are the needs and interests of developing countries, including their civil societies? As was mentioned by previous speakers, and I would totally agree and argue that even before, there has been a growing recognition in developing countries, in least developed countries, among their civil society, of the linkages between trade, environment, and development. Their overarching objective remained inclusive growth and development through trade, while taking into account issues such as climate change, on which a lot of information has been shared. And I can also share that as long ago as 2011. Since then, we have been working at the request of several developing countries on trade and climate change linkages. So given all that, clearly, as we try to rebuild, build back better, or as I like to call, building better together, there are opportunities and there are challenges. On the opportunity, given these trends, this is an opportunity to strengthen the broader trends of what we have witnessed before COVID, of looking at things more holistically and not in a trade-only silo. Also, this is an opportunity to build on the existing recognition and buy-in in developing countries and LDCs. The challenge, on the other hand, I would be, if I could say it in very brief words, and I think that's where Caroline was particularly referring to, how to do more with less. Are there enough resources for that? And also, let me add to that, the other challenge is how to balance the immediate needs versus long-term interest and requirements. And these are two very formidable critical challenges. In this effort, on the main risks, again, I could not agree more with Caroline when she referred to the need for beneficiaries' ownership. This is a point I always emphasize, probably in every speaking assignment that I have, that the temptation to have a top-down approach must be avoided. That would be the greatest risk against buying in from the beneficiaries. And the second risk, which was alluded to by Olivier, also the temptation to take a mechanical approach, ticking the boxes. That does happen in real life, and these will be the two main risks: avoiding a top-down approach and somehow avoiding this going down the route of mechanical approach. The possible way forward, including towards MC12, unlike I can agree with Caroline's four-pronged approach, I had in mind three things that I saw going forward. One I would call the process, which is a collaborative approach to build multi-stakeholder ownership, where developing countries, LDCs, their civil society feel empowered. Two, substance, a holistic anchoring in the SDGs. I think that would provide a good overall substantive anchor and make sure that this remains holistic. If one looks at various SDGs, I don't have the time to go into that, but even one SDG 17, which has 19 targets, more than half of them are linked to what we are talking about now. And the third point would be resources. I won't belabor that point anymore after what particularly Caroline said, that there is an absolute need to find additional and adequate resources to match the ambition that we are talking about, to match the needs, and through substantive, substantial, and sustained interventions. For the MC12, I would see like working along these three lines, and I think MC12 will be a great opportunity to take stock of where do we stand in terms of process, in terms of substance, and in terms of resources, and then try to chart a collective way forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rashid, for these very insightful remarks, reminding us of the context, including the positive developments before the COVID-19 pandemic, and also sharing views on how to make aid for trade and related initiatives work in support of developing countries in the fulfillment of their trade and sustainable development objectives. Thanks very much for outlining some of the risks and opportunities. I'm sure that we are all taking note of your very insightful comments. Among them, the need to have a longer term approach, to count on beneficiary ownership, to avoid a top-down approach, and avoiding, as you called, mechanical approaches. So I'm sure that we are going to come back on those very interesting points in the next round. Thanks very much, Rashid. I'm very pleased to give the floor to our next discussant, Ms. Stacy Mills, who is a consultant with the Environment and Trade Hub at the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, who is joining us from Australia at a very late hour. Stacy, welcome. Could you please explain some specific trade and environment challenges that could be addressed through greener aid for trade, and perhaps some concrete options that could boost the contribution of aid for trade to a green economic recovery? Stacy, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Soledad, and thank you, Natalie and Carolyn, for this great event. It's a really interesting topic, so happy to be involved. Look, in terms of environmental challenges, I think we all know that the health of the planet is at risk due to climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution, and these environmental crises have trade impacts and are hampering countries' efforts to achieve the sustainable development goals. Developing countries in particular face the challenge of double exposure to economic and environmental risks, such as commodity price shocks, climate change, and desertification. So aid for trade really, and trade institutions generally, have a critical role to play in promoting coherence between trade and the environment and social dimensions of sustainable development, whilst also increasing the participation of developing countries in international trade. So in terms of how a green aid for trade can, and in some instances already is, helping developing countries build resilience to environmental and economic shocks and support efforts to achieve the SDGs. Some specific examples might include providing capacity building support to help businesses take advantage of new green export opportunities and integrate into sustainable supply chains through adoption of sustainability standards and improvements to quality infrastructure, for example. Other types of projects could include supporting the development of climate resilient port and other key trade-related infrastructure, supporting climate adaptation measures to protect and enhance key export sectors such as tourism and agriculture, promoting investment in the use of renewable energies and cleaner, more efficient technologies and production processes. And a final example might be supporting the development of trade policies and regulations that provide, to ensure that provide adequate protections for the environment and the ecosystems that ultimately underpin economic activity and trade. So looking at some concrete options and approaches that could boost the contribution of aid for trade and help countries address these trade and environment challenges. I think there's 5 that come to mind, and I'll just mention them relatively briefly. Of course, there might be others. So raising awareness among donors and partner countries about the potential of aid for trade to build resilience and promote green growth, which I think is happening now, but there's more that can be done. Working with beneficiaries to identify their trade and environment challenges and priorities through needs assessments, and then identifying a framework for addressing these, including through aid for trade. Mainstreaming climate and environmental considerations in aid for trade planning and projects. And there's been some work on this, so I think there's a great opportunity to build on that and take it forward. Number 4 would be better measure and share information about how the environment is being conceptualized and integrated into aid for trade projects and strategies. And I think this can really build on the information that's going to be gathered during the forthcoming monitoring and evaluation exercise. And finally, as has been mentioned before, resourcing is a key issue, so securing additional aid for trade funding will be really important. And lastly, in terms of taking the agenda forward at MC12, I think, as Caroline mentioned, this is a great opportunity here for a ministerial declaration on environmental sustainability to say something on or provide clear sort of commitments around greening aid for trade, recognize the important role that it plays. And just to mention that something that's a good precursor to that, I guess, is the statement made by trade ministers at the G7 meeting, where they recognize that this is going to be a very crucial year to drive international efforts to address climate change and protect nature. And they've committed to deepen discussions on the nexus between trade, climate, and the environment. So I think that that's great to have that high-level political acknowledgement of the issue and the need to accelerate action in this space. But yeah, look, moving back to the MC12, I think here in a statement, a ministerial declaration, for example, there could be calls for a review of aid for trade data collection and the monitoring system to ensure that it's really systematically and accurately capturing and reporting information. So Olivia mentioned there's some work being done on this now, but obviously there's that perhaps more that could be done in that space. You facilitate information exchange and learning from the experience of others, perhaps by a dedicated platform to help, facilitate that information exchange. And of course, at some point, if we're looking at mainstreaming climate and environmental considerations in for trade, we have to sort of look at the consensus building around how you do that, what's the methodology going to be, and that's another area in addition to funding, which I mentioned before, that I think will be important to address at that forum. So I'll leave it there, Soledad. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much to you, Stacey, for your thoughts on the main challenges facing developing countries on the trade and environment front, and on how greener aid for trade could contribute to a green economic recovery. Thanks also for suggesting 5 very concrete issue areas and approaches, and for suggesting what members could do at the MC12. Thanks very much for these suggestions and for giving us a food for thought. Thanks again. Your intervention on specific trade and environmental challenges brings us to specific sectors of the economy and the need to channel aid for trade related initiatives to sustainable infrastructure, as you mentioned, Stacey. In this context, I am very pleased to invite my dear colleague, Lisbeth Kazier, who is Senior Policy Advisor at IISD. Lisbeth, could you please share your insights into the role that sustainable infrastructure plays as a means to achieve the SDGs, in particular the role of sustainable transport-related infrastructure? You have the floor, Lisbeth.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Soledad, for having me here to share some thoughts on this topic that I'm in and of itself not that familiar with, but I've noted in the comments that were made earlier that infrastructure itself is, of course, an important pillar of aid for trade. And so I'll just share with you a couple of reflections. First of all, infrastructure investment is really a cross-cutting theme for delivering the Sustainable Development Goals, which is why it is actually so important that aid for trade, if it goes to infrastructure projects that help to deliver the SDGs. Infrastructure investment is a powerful driver of economic activity. That's also why I believe we will see much more of this in the future as part of recovery strategies in response to the economic damage from the pandemic. And infrastructure done right and done in a sustainable way holds enormous potential for alleviating poverty, improving access to basic services, as well as to markets, creates jobs, it's necessary for businesses to grow, and ultimately can really contribute to well-being of people and the planet. A couple of examples of this cross-cutting nature of infrastructure and the SDGs. In terms of ending poverty, SDG 1 targets refer to the need for resilient infrastructure, access to basic public services in relation to water, energy, health, education. SDG 2, ending hunger, for which there is a need for further development of rural infrastructure, as well as, of course, market access. SDG 6 on water, SDG 7 on energy, both of which require enormous investments in green and sustainable infrastructure. And if that link is not yet explicit enough, there's also the explicit SDG 9 on infrastructure, there's SDG 11 on building resilient cities, with multiple mentions of the need to invest in climate resilient urban infrastructure in various infrastructure sectors, from buildings, transport, waste, etc. And we could go on looking through all the SDGs. But if we focus a little bit on transport-related infrastructure, which is that one of these essential pieces of Aid for Trade projects, then that's of course equally cross-cutting in it that it provides the enabling infrastructure for people and companies for market access. And I had the privilege of reading through Caroline's paper, and also note there that about 55% of the Aid for Trade for least developed countries actually goes to trade-related infrastructure, roads, ports, telecommunication, and the supporting energy networks. At the same time, we also know that roads, the aviation sector, waterborne and rail transport currently produce almost 1/4 of total global energy-related CO2 emissions. And increasingly, those are also infrastructure sectors that are being confronted with the impacts of climate change, in particular, the increases in extreme weather events. So it's really essential, I believe, in the discussions on greening aid for trade, that the infrastructure being financed through those initiatives is sustainable infrastructure. And with that, we mean infrastructure that is low carbon and has a lower environmental footprint, infrastructure that is climate resilient, infrastructure that conserves the natural ecosystems around it, but infrastructure that also, of course, looks at job creation and increasing long-term employment that triggers technological and industrial innovation across value chains, but also infrastructure that is financially viable over its lifetime and that ultimately delivers value for money for citizens. So how do we do that? How do we make sure that infrastructure indeed does become sustainable infrastructure? This is where we very much support some of the elements that have been said before. We really need integrated approaches. We need to look at this in a systemic manner so that we integrate sustainability in all aspects of the infrastructure cycle, from planning to procurement to financing. And in order to do so, we should integrate, on the one hand, the economic, climate, health, and other environmental and social benefits into the assessments of infrastructure projects. And on the other hand, what we need to do is become much better at integrating environmental, social, governance, as well as climate-related risks into infrastructure planning, into infrastructure financing. And if we do that, then the more we do that, the more financially sustainable projects can become reality. And those will also be the projects that deliver the value for money for citizens. Increasingly, that will also, and this is extremely important in relation to developing countries, it will lead to cost savings over the lifetime of those projects. With budgets being stressed, this is an essential element to take into account. And I would just like to highlight two examples of pieces of work that we've been involved in at IISD, where we actually assessed infrastructure projects, assessed the climate risks of those infrastructure projects in relation to the transport sector. One example comes from an assessment of road infrastructure, where we modeled various scenarios that looked at the financial impact of climate change on specific roads. And we found that the increased droughts projected to happen in Morocco show us that the current maintenance budgets for the roads were insufficient. So it's essential, if we want to get infrastructure right, that we look for those climate scenarios so that we can identify solutions for adapting to climate change in infrastructure. And the second example is an economic and financial assessment of a bus rapid transit infrastructure project in Dakar, in Senegal. And in that project, it was of essence to really look beyond a traditional scope of looking at an infrastructure project, but looking at the wider economic benefits, such as the value of the time savings thanks to a project, looking at the increased spending in the economy, thanks to the jobs that were directly and indirectly created through the BRT. And we also looked at the value of savings in health costs related to pollutants of the other methods of transportation from which people shift away with the implementation of the BRT projects. So in summary, we believe that aid for trade that invests in infrastructure will only deliver on the SDGs if it invests in infrastructure that is low carbon, that is resilient, and that maximizes those social benefits. Thank you.
Many thanks, Lisbeth, for this explanation on how sustainable infrastructure connects to the SDGs and on their contribution, the contribution they can make in the fulfillment of such objectives. Thanks also for indicating what would be required for infrastructure projects to be sustainable. And thanks for providing some concrete examples on transport-related infrastructure and enumerating some conditions. Thanks very much again. Having addressed specific sectors, I would like to refer now to specific actors who are at the heart of economic activity, which are the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises known as MSMEs. In order to do that, I am very pleased to invite our next discussant, Ms. Annegret Brouws, who is the coordinator of the Green to Compete initiative at the International Trade Center, ITC. Annegret, welcome. We are very keen to listen to your explanation on how green aid for trade can support the efforts of MSMEs in developing countries to compete in green markets and adapt to evolving environmental and market conditions. In doing so, could you please explain what are some of the main priorities, challenges, and opportunities? Annegret, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Soledad. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this very timely discussion on greening aid for trade. And also thank you very much to the previous speakers for their really great interventions, a lot of very good ideas and thoughts that come. As Soledad said, I'm really going to focus on the SME perspective in relation to aid for trade. For small businesses in developing countries, aid for trade is really one of the support mechanisms that is the most key. And this has become even more true since, on top of existing developmental challenges, the complexities of the environmental crisis, we can, I think, really call it a crisis since they were added. And the difference between what we have seen, for instance, previously in terms of economic crisis and the current environmental crisis is really that this one is here to last. So previously, we might have had economic downturns and companies had those effects, and most of them, where possible, would recover. With this environmental crisis, what we are going to see is continuous impacts over and over again for the next decades to come. And if we believe what researchers do tell us about how climate change will evolve, the impacts will also increase in their magnitude. So this is really to say that aid for trade is this key support instrument. And I'm really hoping that with the focus on a green recovery after COVID, we're also bringing back some of the donors that might have focused on other topics over the past year. So this being said, there is of course a silver lining to all of that. And that is because the green transition may actually be the biggest business opportunity that we have seen in decades. So implementing environmental practices has often been regarded as a means for SMEs to survive. And I give you some examples. So it's about increasing climate resilience so that they don't get swept away by climate shocks. It's a response to stricter environmental requirements from international buyers who, based on consumer demands, are becoming, these demands are really becoming a pain point for international companies and putting on these demands to actors in their supply chains. It was also seen mainly as a response to becoming compliant with the changing legislation. So meaning that if you're a lagger in that space, you're really losing out. And I think this narrative put SMEs really into a reactive and passive position as just being the taker of what is coming. And now we actually see that this kind of narrative is changing. SMEs are not only in this game to survive, but it's really about them thriving. And this is also what our Green to Compete initiative is really focusing on. We just launched yesterday our SME competitiveness outlook. It's on the green recovery, and it has interesting data on this. So what we've seen is that in our surveys of African companies, nearly 60% of the companies surveyed said that making green investments into their enterprise led to different advantages. new and higher quality products, access to new markets, lower production costs. And they were also better positioned to tap into growing pots of green finance. So this really illustrates that companies are more and more seeing this as an opportunity. And we also have examples for this as part of our projects. For instance, in the textile producers in the MENA regions, ones that we're working with, we have one really interesting example that is taking the sludge from the production to make concrete stones. And they're even thinking about venturing into solar energy provision. So this is really going even into different direction than textiles. In another sector, in the coffee sector in Uganda, we're working with coffee processors, and they're using the coffee pulp, which often has been a waste, to produce compost for the farmers so that they can better grow the coffee. So these are all, let's say, reactions that pertain to circular economy opportunities, that pertain to simply going greener as an enterprise, that companies are already realizing. And so this is back again to Aid for Trade. This is where Aid for Trade comes into the picture. And I can only reiterate what previous speakers have pointed to. Aid for Trade really needs to consistently reflect those green priorities from needs assessment all the way to implementation. Even more importantly, Aid for Trade should also really focus on the opportunity side. So from opportunities emanates new growth. And it's really, as we see in nature, whenever a new plant grows, it's green. New growth is really green. So what does this mean now for SMEs from developing countries? When we looked at developed markets, established companies, it will be easy for them to realize those opportunities. The markets are more developed, they have access to services around them, to products. Companies in their value chains are already doing this. Their suppliers also have picked up on this need, that consumers are demanding it. And importantly, the solutions do exist in their context. The difference is that often in developing countries, it's not so evident, right? The ecosystems are not there yet. The solutions that are needed are still under development. So this is really where Aid for Trade is key in order to also enable SMEs to realize those opportunities because of the support around them. So what I want to say is that beyond, of course, directly working with SMEs and to empower them to go green and use this as an opportunity, I referred to different examples earlier. Aid for Trade also really needs to focus on establishing those ecosystems that already exist in developed markets. So what does this mean, for example? Companies do rely on external finance. If there are climate shocks, they even rely on insurance. So how can these be made better available to the needs for local SMEs in developing countries? Working with the institutions, chambers of commerce, that they can act as multipliers of sustainability, that they have the services that companies, for instance, need. It's about when looking at development of sectors, is there a way that Aid for Trade can support the development specifically of green sectors or in traditional sectors to really focus on moving entire sectors on a more environmentally friendly trajectory? It's also about the trade rules, and there, of course, on the one hand, market access, but also on the other hand, access to green technologies and services. I said earlier, in the developed market, it might not be so difficult to come about clean fuels, etc. But in a developing country, it's a different story. So aligning, finally, also trade policies with environmental objectives is also a key role where I think Aid for Trade can play a role. And my last point is really also in relation to what does this mean for actors that provide Aid for Trade related assistance about in relation to us, development organizations. It's really, it sounds like everybody is saying it, but it's really about coordinating. For instance, in our Green to Compete hubs in different countries, whenever we have seen work, for instance, by UNIDO, by their cleaner production centers, we're always referring to, okay, what has been established by them? What are the good practices? Are there already knowledgeable people on the ground that we can work with? And so it's about really practically putting this type of coordination into action and exchanging those experiences. So yeah, to close, I think in this way, Aid for Trade can really contribute to making environmental sustainability not only a priority out of pressure, but a real source of competitive advantage for SMEs. Thank you.
Many thanks, Annegret, for your intervention, for sharing your thoughts and introducing us to the initiatives that your institution conducts, and also for highlighting the contribution in support of MSMEs in developing countries. Thanks also for sharing concrete examples of the work you conduct, and also for pointing us to concrete actions. Thanks again. It is now our great pleasure and honor to welcome His Excellency Dr. Muhammad Mujaba Piracha, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Pakistan to the WTO. Ambassador Piracha, among other responsibilities, is the chair of the WTO Committee on Trade and Development. Ambassador Piracha, we are very honored to have you here today. We would like to ask your views on how the discussions on environmental sustainability connect to the trade and development agenda, and on how Aid for Trade could support opportunities for green trade and economic diversification. You may also wish to refer in this round of comments to the steps that members are taking or could take on the road to MC12 and to the next Aid for Trade Global Review. Thank you very much, Ambassador Piracha.
Well, thank you very much, Soledad, and thank you for having me. It's quite informative, and I'm glad to be here and share these thoughts with you as the chair of CTD, but also as Ambassador of Pakistan to WTO. So today's discussion is timely, not just in context of the Aid for Trade work program. It is also pertinent given other ongoing environment-related discussions at the WTO. For instance, the launch of the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions and deliberations in the CTE. There have been work that Professor Deer has been involved on plastics on the sidelines also, amongst other initiatives. So developing members have actively been contributing to this discussion. We heard valuable insights during the recent workshop we had on circular economy, economic diversification, and Aid for Trade. As in any dialogue, there are some that are more advanced in what they've done and more active than others. Some have indicated a determination to transform existing economic activities to promote sustainability, while others are still in the process of firming up what they would like to see and do as member states. This transformation or realignment will, however, not be easy, as most of you here have very aptly pointed out. For one, the interactions between trade and green economy themes are not clearly defined. In addition, many developing countries may inevitably face steep adjustment costs. That's been aptly pointed out. Some of these can expect to be market-led processes. For example, consumers paying more for goods with green credentials. Others may be imposed by regulation-led processes. One discussion to cite here is, of course, a discussion around the carbon border adjustment measures that had been floated by member states recently. So the second question that you've asked me to answer is, how could Aid for Trade support opportunities for green trade and economic diversification? So Aid for Trade can be catalytic in this context at two levels. Firstly, it can help to understand the scale of the challenge and make the case for financing needed to effect change. Secondly, Aid for Trade can help to mobilize the critical supply side infrastructure that will enable green transformation. Let me provide a country-specific example of how Aid for Trade can be used to leverage the green economy. According to the Pakistan Environmental Protection Agency, Pakistan generates about 20 million tons of solid waste annually, which I think is a gross underestimation. This figure has been shown to grow by 2.4% each year. Municipal authorities in Pakistan manage to collect only half of this waste. The rest is either incinerated or left in dumps. Addressing this by creating loops as informed by circular economy practices can certainly help alleviate some of the resulting issues. We've already seen progress in this. Green Earth Recycling, a domestic establishment, is working with Unilever Pakistan to recover and recycle around 2,000 tons of plastic waste. The collected plastic will be used to create benches, desks, play areas, and other outdoor furniture. Such initiatives are welcome, but we need to also keep in perspective, after all, Pakistan is around 220 million people. We need, therefore, to investigate how Aid for Trade can catalyze robust action, not just at national level, but also to integrate such green practices into the international trading system. Concurrently, I believe that Aid for Trade should also look to foster an inclusive green economy. In the context of Pakistan, for instance, the informal sector scavenges a bulk of metal, glass, paper, and plastic waste. So you see these collectors go around, they're self-employed, going around on bicycles, and they actually pay households who collect newspapers, plastics, glass, separated at the collection level and bought by these self-employed people who go and sell them in bulk. And this has been happening not recently, but I've been seeing it for the last 40 years. To integrate within these existing practices in the informal sector would be key. And I think to come back to some of the issues that have been pointed out, I think clearly climate change, the circular economy, pollution in the oceans is a global issue. And the sliver the solutions have to be global. Trade is a small part of some of these large economies, and Pakistan being prime example of that. And aid for trade within that is a very small sliver of what can be used to push into this direction. Now, having said that, the value that we have is in, as aptly pointed out earlier, is developing models of public-private and private-private partnership, even public-to-public partnership internationally, as well as locally. Once these models are developed and they are seen and disseminated as cost-effective and can lead to better competitiveness for markets that are more sensitive to green production, they would be adopted locally at a higher rate. But what I really want to point out is that sometimes in some of the poorer countries, the demand for circular economy is, or for climate change issues, the awareness, the demand is not that huge. The political pressure is not huge for political change or policy change to take place. So that becomes just to handle it with one handle of trade, and within that aid for trade, small as it is, and it's shrinking, is not the only lever that has to be used here. There has to be other levers that have to come into play. And as some of these points have been pointed out very well, and I just second them here. When it comes to what could be the next steps in the context of Aid for Trade Global Review and MC12, the recent momentum regarding this topic has been picking up, and there's definitely a scope for next steps. However, at the end of the day, and the fisheries negotiations, as anyone, all of you have probably been following, is an indicator of that. WTO is a consensus-led body. The future of the agenda really lies with the membership. As far as MC12 is concerned, it already has a heavy agenda, given that this has been a COVID year. Things have really slowed down. They're saying it might be a non-negotiating MC. They want to arrive at whatever possible convergences they can before the MC12. We're not even sure right now if it will be hybrid mode or everybody will be here physically, which is still yet to be decided. The process where we are with the global review to take place in 2022 would really then set the grounds for pushing this agenda in a more holistic and a unidirectional sort of way. So I stop at that. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Ambassador Piracha, for your very insightful comments on how to make aid for trade and related initiatives work, and also for your call for global solutions to environmental challenges and for enumerating some of them. We also appreciate very much that you shared a concrete example on Pakistan, and also on your views on the process towards MC12 and the global review next year. Thanks very much again for joining us. I have to confess that we are a few minutes late, and I will have to skip the Q&A segment because I understand that many of you have to go and join other calls, other meetings, some of you even in-person meetings. So, but what I commit to do is that I'm gonna take forward the questions that some of you have submitted. 2 or 3 of them are directed towards Olivier and Michael on the Aid for Trade initiatives. And I think we will have to go straight to the closing part of this interesting and very fascinating panel discussion. So yes, I would like to go to the last part of the event. The interventions were so rich that I didn't dare ask speakers and discussants to do shorter interventions because they were so inspiring. So what I want to say is that the recording will be available on the website, and you will receive as well an email indicating where to find the material, and also hopefully answers to the questions you have so kindly shared. So well, this brings me to the end of our event. Thanks very much for the interventions and for the extremely fascinating and fruitful event. We have revisited the origins and evolution of aid for trade and related initiatives, and how these initiatives connect to the broader Sustainable Development Agenda and the SDGs. We have received insights into how environmental considerations have been included in the discussions on aid for trade, and how these considerations are taken forward by different actors, including by WTO members on the road to MC12 and the 2022 Aid for Trade Global Review. We have listened to a broad range of views on some of the main policy issues at stake, and on some specific measures and actions needed for the initiatives to support developing countries in the fulfillment of their broader sustainable development objectives. In particular, we have listened to specific initiatives in this regard and on what is being planned by different actors. So now, on behalf of the co-hosts, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to all speakers, discussants, and attendees for making their valuable time available across a wide range of time zones to join us for this enriching discussion. We greatly appreciate all of you sharing your insights and knowledge with us. Many thanks to Caroline for co-hosting this event with IISD and for her scoping paper, to Natalie for her introductory remarks, to Sophia for her technical moderation and communication supports, and to Rebecca, and to the rest of the IISD team behind this webinar. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much, everyone.